Tonight, let us step back more than 5 centuries to the year 1469. The city is Florence, jewel of Tuscany, shadowed by rivalry and intrigue. It is here, on the 3rd day of May, that a child is born whose name will one day echo in whispers of power and cunning, Niccolò Machiavelli. There are no banners raised above the rooftops, no bells tolling in celebration. He is not the son of a duke or prince, but of a modest family in a city already crowded with genius. His father, Bernardo, works as a lawyer of middling fortune, a man respected more for learning than wealth. His mother, Bartolomea, tends the household with quiet diligence. The boy's full name is written plainly in parish records, Niccolò di Bernardo di Machiavelli. Nothing in that ink suggests the storm that would follow, and yet, like Leonardo da Vinci, whose childhood unfolded not far away, this boy will grow to embody a truth larger than himself. The truth of how men wield power, how cities rise and fall, how ideals bend before necessity. To know the child, one must first know his city. Florence in the 15th century was no ordinary place. It was a republic in name, ruled by councils and assemblies, but in spirit it pulsed with ambition and rivalry. Walk its narrow streets, and you would smell the dying vats of the wool guilds, hear the bargaining of merchants selling silks, brought from the east. Feel the heat of ovens spilling bread and chestnuts into the air. Gold florins clinked in the hands of bankers, whose reach extended from London to Constantinople. Poets and philosophers debated in taverns, while artists sketched saints and heroes upon scraps of parchment. And always, above the city, loomed Brunelleschi's dome, vast, red, impossibly suspended over Santa Maria del Fiore. It was a crown upon Florence, a reminder that this city was not merely trading goods, but shaping civilization itself. This was the air Niccolò breathed, rich with brilliance, sharp with danger. His family, though respectable, lived without luxury. Bernardo Machiavelli's career as a lawyer brought only modest means, often strained by debts. But in their home there was one treasure more valuable than coin books. Bernardo kept a small library, and in those volumes young Niccolò found his earliest teachers. There was Livy, chronicler of Rome's rise and fall. There was Cicero, whose speeches blended eloquence with politics. There were the verses of Dante and Petrarch, weaving together faith, longing, and civic pride. Niccolò read them not as distant tales, but as living voices. He studied Latin with diligence, though he would never master it as perfectly as the wealthy sons of Florence. Still, he learned enough to step into the world of the ancients, a world where republics were built, armies marched, and men grappled with the same passions and ambitions he would one day write about. Even as a boy, he read with an eye for pattern. Where others admired heroes, he asked why did this one succeed, and that one fail? Why did republics endure, and why did they collapse? His education was not only of letters, but of suspicion that beneath noble words lay harder truths. Florence was never still. Beneath its beauty, ambitions stirred. Families contended for power, and the Medici, bankers of enormous wealth, loomed over all. They ruled not by crown but by influence. Their hands stretched through loans, favours, and alliances. In 1478, when Niccolò was only 9, the city erupted in one of its most shocking moments. The Pazzi Conspiracy. It was Easter Sunday. The cathedral was filled with worshippers, sunlight streaming through stained glass. Lorenzo de' Medici, called the Magnificent, stood with his brother Giuliano, heads bowed in prayer. Suddenly, steel flashed. Conspirators, daggers hidden beneath their cloaks, struck. Giuliano fell, stabbed 19 times, bleeding upon the marble floor. Lorenzo, wounded, fought his way to safety. Panic surged through the cathedral. Bells tolled in alarm. Within hours, vengeance swept the streets. Conspirators were dragged through the city, beaten, hanged from palace windows, their bodies left swaying as warnings. For young Niccolò, such scenes were unforgettable. Florence was no idol of art and learning alone. It was a place where blood was spilled at the altar, where power was a matter of life and death. Later, when he wrote that a ruler must not shrink from cruelty if it preserved the state, he was not speaking theory. He was recalling the lessons of his childhood. Yet childhood was not all conspiracies and terror. For Niccolò, daily life unfolded in simpler rhythms as well. He learned letters from tutors, practiced logic, copied Latin phrases, He walked the streets with friends, watched markets bustle, listened to sermons in churches. He saw artists at work on frescoes, their brushes filling plaster with colour. But even in ordinary moments, he observed with unusual sharpness. When priests spoke of sin and salvation, he noted how men confessed on Sunday, but schemed again by Monday. When merchants bargained, he noticed how promises shifted once gold changed hands. Where other boys laughed and ran, Nickel lingered, watching, measuring. It is worth pausing here to imagine him, a boy of 12, leaning against the corner of a stone building, listening as two men whisper of alliances. He does not interrupt. He does not join. He simply watches, eyes alert, storing away the truth that words are masks, that beneath them lies another game. This habit of observation, begun in childhood, would never leave him. Florence, more than most cities, was filled with contradictions. On one street, a procession of friars chanted hymns. On another, young men quarrelled with knives. Wealth glittered in palaces, yet famine could stalk the poor. Philosophers debated virtue, while politicians plotted betrayal. Niccolò grew in the midst of this tension. He saw that ideals and realities did not always match. Where others sought to reconcile them, he learned to separate them. There was the world men said should exist, the world of sermons, poetry, ideals. And there was the world as it truly was, the world of conspiracies, debts, violence, and ambition. This division, planted early, would later shape every page of The Prince. The Machiavellis were neither rich nor destitute. They were citizens of some standing, with enough connections to remain secure, but never enough to dominate. Bernardo's debts often left the family on uneasy footing. Niccolò knew privilege enough to glimpse power, but not enough to wield it. This, too, mattered. He grew up close enough to watch the powerful, but distant enough to remain skeptical of them. He would not become their servant in childhood, nor their equal. He would become their critic. As the 1480s waned, Florence glittered under Lorenzo di Medici's rule. Art flourished. Botticelli painted The Birth of Venus. Michelangelo began his apprenticeship. Scholars translated Greek texts into Latin. Yet behind the brilliance, foreign powers stirred. France eyed Italy. Spain tightened its grip on Naples. The peninsula was a chessboard, its cities pieces to be played. Niccolò, still a youth, could not yet act, but he absorbed the mood. He read of Rome's republic and looked at Florence's. He heard sermons praising virtue and saw men practicing vice. He watched his city praise liberty while bowing to wealth. These contradictions, drawn into his bones, would one day pour out in words sharper than swords. Thus we leave him here, Niccolò Machiavelli, child of Florence, raised amid books and blood, beauty and betrayal. He is not yet secretary, not yet author, not yet the exile who will write the most infamous book of politics. He is still only a boy, but a boy learning lessons that no classroom could teach. The world expects little of him, but he expects everything of the world. Already, he sees it not as it pretends to be, but as it is. And that difference, quietly forming in his childhood, will shape all that follows. In the year 1494, when Niccolò Machiavelli was 25, Florence trembled. The world he had known since childhood shifted suddenly, violently, and nothing would be the same again. For 60 years, the Medici family had guided Florence. Bankers, patrons, sometimes rulers, always the power behind the councils. But now storms gathered. Charles V of France marched into Italy with an army of mercenaries, claiming the throne of Naples, but casting his shadow over all the peninsula. The Medici, caught between foreign powers and domestic anger, lost their grip. Lorenzo the Magnificent was gone. His son Piero, the unfortunate, proved unsteady, and Florence turned against them. The Medici fled into exile. For the first time in his life, Niccolò lived in a Florence not ruled by Medici patronage, but by Republican experiment. Into this new republic he stepped, but Florence was no ordinary republic in those days. Into the vacuum left by the Medici stepped a Dominican friar, Girolamo Savonarola. Tall, gaunt, with eyes that burned with conviction, Savonarola thundered from the pulpits of San Marco and the Duomo. He preached of Florence's sins, its vanity, its luxury, its corruption. He warned of God's wrath, declaring that Florence must be purified or destroyed. His voice rose over crowds in the piazzas, echoing against stone walls until thousands believed he spoke as prophet. Under his spell, Florence became a city of extremes. Citizens marched through the streets singing hymns. Youths patrolled with clubs, urging neighbours to repent. Bonfires of the vanities consumed mirrors, playing cards, paintings deemed indecent. For Niccolò, who had grown up noting the contradictions of human nature, Savonarola was living proof of both the power and danger of persuasion. Here was no prince, no banker, no soldier, only a friar with words. And yet, he held the city in his hands. In this volatile moment, Niccolò received his first appointment. In June 1498, after Savonarola's fall from grace and execution, the Florentine Republic restructured its government. Machiavelli, 29 years old, was named second Chancellor of the Republic. A post within the Chancery, the heart of Florence's administration. It was not glamorous. The office was filled with paper, ink, endless correspondence. Yet it was here that Niccolò's real education began. As Chancellor, he drafted official letters, recorded decisions, kept the machinery of government running. He handled correspondence with Florence's ambassadors and allies. His Latin was put to use, his pen became his tool, and with every document, he glimpsed the heartbeat of politics. For a man of his temperament, observant, skeptical, fascinated by power, this was no mere job. It was access. Through parchment and ink, he began to see how cities lived, how leaders maneuvered, how fragile power could be. Even as he took office, the memory of Savonarola lingered. The friar who had once seemed to command Florence's soul had been abandoned by the same crowds who once adored him. In 1498, he was arrested, tortured, and hanged in the Piazza della Signoria, his body burned, his ashes cast into the Arno. For Machiavelli, the lesson was clear. Power based on faith alone was fleeting. A ruler who relied solely on ideals, without armies or institutions, would fall as swiftly as he rose. Later, when he wrote in The Prince that prophets unarmed always come to ruin, he was thinking of Savonarola. The new republic that emerged was fragile but ambitious. It sought to balance councils, magistrates, and popular voices. It wanted to defend liberty while warding off foreign invasion. It wanted stability without Medici dominance. Machiavelli, a junior functionary, was no decision maker yet, but he was inside the walls where decisions were made. He heard the debates of the Signoria, the arguments of magistrates, the complaints of citizens. He copied letters to ambassadors, noting how tone and timing shaped negotiations. Florence, as it wrestled with survival, became his teacher. Where others saw crisis, Machiavelli saw laboratory. Every failure, every triumph, every intrigue became data for the theories he would later write. Picture Machiavelli, not yet the author of The Prince, not yet the exile, but a young man in ink-stained robes, sitting at a wooden desk in the Palazzo Vecchio. Outside, bells ring across Florence, echoing over tiled roofs. Inside, by the dim light of candles, Machiavelli bends over parchment, his hand moving steadily, his mind absorbing everything. Imagine him listening as older men debate whether to ally with France or resist. Imagine him copying letters from generals describing battles against Pisa. Imagine him noticing not only what was said, but what was not. The silences, the evasions, the contradictions. This was his first true apprenticeship, not in a studio of art, but in the chancery of statecraft. His brushes were pens, his colours were words, his canvas was Florence itself. Yet Machiavelli's education was not confined to government chambers. He still walked Florence's piazzas, still watched its people. He attended festivals where masked revellers paraded through the streets, singing ballads that mocked politics. He listened to sermons where priests thundered about salvation while nobles schemed in pews. Where others joined in, he observed. He noted how easily crowds could be swayed, how quickly laughter turned to anger, how a song could wound as deeply as a sword. Already, he was learning what he would one day write plainly, that appearances matter, that men follow what they see and feel, not what they reason. Outside Florence, Italy shook. France, Spain, the papacy, and the Holy Roman Empire all vied for dominance. Armies marched across the peninsula, leaving cities in fear. Machiavelli, though still junior, read the dispatches that flowed into Florence, reports of sieges, betrayals, shifting alliances. These letters gave him a view larger than Florence alone. He began to see Italy as a whole, a chessboard where kings and popes moved pieces, and small republics like his own risked being swept away. Thus, in the years 1494 to 1498, Niccolò Machiavelli stepped from youth into service. He was not yet powerful, not yet famous, but he was inside the machine of the Republic, watching its gears turn. He saw the fall of the Medici, the rise and ruin of Savonarola, the fragile hopes of a new government. He learned that faith without force collapses, that words without armies fail, that liberty is fragile without vigilance. He learned these not from books alone, but from parchment, piazzas, and prisons. And so we leave him here young, ambitious, still only a secretary, but already gathering the lessons that will make his name endure. When Niccolò Machiavelli accepted his post as second Chancellor of Florence in 1498, he did not know that his pen would soon carry him across Italy and beyond. For nearly a decade, he was sent on diplomatic missions, journeys that transformed him from a clerk of letters into an observer of princes, kings, and popes. These missions became the crucible in which his political thought was forged. Florence entrusted him not with armies, but with words, dispatches, reports, letters back to the Signoria. And yet, through these assignments, he saw what few men of his station could see, the very workings of power. Naked and unadorned. In 1500, Machiavelli was sent to France. Imagine him crossing the Alps, riding through valleys still dusted with snow, entering lands far different from Tuscany's olive groves and vineyards. France was larger, richer, more centralized than Florence. Its king, Louis XII, was no banker's son but a monarch by birthright, commanding armies that dwarfed those of Italian states. Machiavelli, standing among courtiers, would have noted the difference immediately. Where Florence's politics were a web of merchants, guilds, and shifting councils, France moved with the singular weight of monarchy. The king's word was law. His nobles bent before him. In his reports, Niccolò marveled at this structure. He described how the kingdom was governed by one man, how loyalty bound nobles to him, how taxes flowed to sustain his army. Later, in The Prince, he would use France as example. A centralized monarchy is hard to conquer, for its strength is unity. But if conquered, it is easy to hold, for its people are accustomed to obedience. For the Florentine Republic, struggling with faction and division, this was both lesson and warning. If France showed him the power of monarchy, Rome revealed the power of faith married to politics. At the turn of the century, the papacy was no mere spiritual institution. It was a temporal power, with armies, fortresses, and lands across central Italy. Popes were not only shepherds of souls, they were princes, and sometimes warlords. Machiavelli travelled often to Rome, carrying Florence's concerns, negotiating with papal officials. He saw firsthand how popes like Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, used their office. Alexander, worldly and cunning, wielded the church not as sanctuary but as weapon. Here, Niccolò observed how religion could be cloaked over ambition. Priests spoke of salvation, but soldiers marched at the Pope's command. Alexander advanced his family's fortunes, elevating his son Cesare Borgia, carving principalities in Romagna. For Machiavelli, this was revelation. If Florence's Friar Savonarola had shown the weakness of prophets unarmed, Alexander VI showed the strength of priests with armies. Faith alone crumbled. Faith with force endured. Above all others, one figure captured Machiavelli's attention. Cesare Borgia, Duke of Valentinois, son of Pope Alexander VI. Cesare was unlike any man Niccolò had yet met. Tall, commanding, ruthless, he embodied what Machiavelli would later call not virtue in the moral sense, but the force of will, boldness, and calculation that bends fortune to its purpose. Between 1502 and 1503, Machiavelli observed Cesare's campaigns in Romagna. Imagine him riding with Florentine envoys, watching Cesare's banners unfurl across towns, hearing the clatter of armoured men. Cesare subdued rebellious cities with speed and cunning. He lured enemies with promises, then destroyed them when convenient. In one famous episode at Senegalia, Cesare invited disloyal captains to a meeting, welcomed them with courtesy, and then had them seized and executed. The swiftness, the decisiveness, the cold calculation struck Machiavelli deeply. In The Prince, years later, he would write, "I shall not hesitate to cite Cesare Borgia. For I do not know what better example to give a new prince. Cesare, for Machiavelli, was the model of how power could be seized and held, at least until fortune turned." Picture Niccolò at a window in some small inn of Romagna, writing by candlelight after a day of negotiations. His hand moves across parchment as he records the events for Florence, Cesare's maneuvers, the loyalties of cities, the betrayals whispered in corridors. But in his mind, he is writing more than a report. He is storing lessons. He notes how fear works swifter than love, how cruelty, if used decisively, can secure peace, how men are loyal only until it no longer suits them. He does not yet put these thoughts into a book. That will come later, in exile. But already, the principles that will fill the prince are being born in these moments, in the flickering light of a diplomat's pen. After Alexander VI's death in 1503, a new pope rose, Julius II, fierce, warlike, a pope who wore armor and led armies into battle. Machiavelli saw in Julius another kind of power, reckless boldness. Julius threw himself into wars against Bologna and Venice, stormed fortresses, defied kings. And fortune, surprisingly, favored him. From Julius, Machiavelli learned another lesson sometimes. Audacity itself can win what caution cannot. Later, he would write of him, Julius succeeded, not because he planned well, but because he was reckless when times demanded recklessness. Machiavelli also travelled north, to the court of Emperor Maximilian. Here, he saw the opposite of France, a vast empire, yet fractured, its princes jealously guarding autonomy, its emperor lacking true central power. For Florence, threatened by large estates, this too was a lesson. Where power was dispersed, unity faltered. Where unity faltered, opportunity emerged. Through these missions, Machiavelli came to see Italy as more than city, states jostling. He saw it as a chessboard, each piece vulnerable to foreign hands. France, Spain, the papacy, the empire, all pressed upon the peninsula. Florence was small, fragile, yet cunning. To survive, it needed more than ideals. It needed clarity, strategy, decisiveness. And so, in the years 1498 to 1507, Niccolò Machiavelli travelled beyond Florence's walls and saw the wider stage of power. He stood before kings, popes, emperors. He watched Cesare Borgia carve a state with sword and cunning. He listened to words of faith cloaking ambition. He saw monarchies strong and empires weak. He returned to Florence with ink-stained fingers, parchments filled with reports. But within himself, he carried something greater, the beginnings of a philosophy. He learned that princes succeed not by goodness alone, but by decisiveness. That fortune favours the bold, but abandons the careless. That cruelty, if swift and well used, can be more merciful than hesitation. That power is not abstract, but flesh and blood. Daggers and gold, loyalty and betrayal. These were the lessons he would one day distill in the prince. But for now, they lived only in his notebooks, his mind, his watchful eyes. When Niccolò Machiavelli returned from his embassies in the early 1500s, he carried more than reports. He carried conviction. He had watched France, with its standing armies, the Pope, with his condottieri, Cesare Borgia, with his ruthless captains. He had seen how wars were won and lost. And he had seen the weakness of Florence. The Republic had no army of its own. When threatened, it hired mercenaries, condottieri, captains of fortune who sold their swords to the highest bidder. These men had fought Italy's wars for centuries, but Machiavelli loathed them. They were unreliable, greedy, and often cowardly. They fought not for country, but for coin. And if they lost, they simply bargained for another contract. Time and again, he had seen cities ruined because mercenaries failed them. In The Prince, he would later write, "Mercenary and auxiliary forces are useless and dangerous. They are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, unfaithful, brave before friends, cowardly before enemies. In peace they plunder you, in war they let themselves be beaten." It was not theory, it was lived experience. By 1507, Machiavelli was convinced that Florence must change. If the Republic was to survive among monarchies and empires, it could not depend on mercenaries. It must have its own army, not hired strangers, but citizens. This idea was radical. Florence was a city of merchants and artisans, not soldiers. Its citizens prized liberty, but not the discipline of war. Yet Machiavelli argued passionately that only a militia drawn from Florence's own people could safeguard liberty. He persuaded the government to give him authority. He began the great experiment of his career, the creation of a Florentine militia. Picture him in the Tuscan countryside, riding from village to village, summoning men to serve. Farmers laid down hoes, artisans set aside tools, young men lined up in dusty fields. Some came reluctantly, some eagerly, some with fear. Machiavelli organized them into companies, taught them to march, to hold pikes, to obey signals. He studied Roman military history, drawing from Livy and Polybius, hoping to revive the discipline of antiquity. He believed that liberty and arms were bound together. A free city must defend itself. It was not easy. The Florentines mocked him, saying merchants could not become soldiers. Aristocrats doubted the loyalty of peasants. Peasants resented leaving fields. Training was slow, discipline fragile. But Machiavelli persisted. He stood in muddy fields, cloak around his shoulders, calling men to order. He drilled them, scolded them, praised them. His pen, once used for letters, was now used for orders of muster. The test came in 1509. Florence had long sought to reclaim Pisa, its rebellious neighbour, which had declared independence. Previous attempts with mercenaries had failed. Now, Machiavelli's militia marched. It was a moment of triumph. Ordinary citizens, trained under his system, fought bravely. Pisa was subdued, and Florence rejoiced. For a brief moment, it seemed Machiavelli had been vindicated. He wrote with pride that free men fighting for their own liberty had achieved what hired soldiers could not. His vision, born of theory and necessity, had become reality. But fortune is fickle. In 1512, as foreign wars raged across Italy, Florence faced new threats. The Spanish army marched into Tuscany, powerful, professional, relentless. Machiavelli's militia, untested against such foes, wavered. At the Battle of Prato, Florence's citizen soldiers collapsed under the Spanish assault. The city fell. Blood ran through its streets. Thousands died. The Republic, defenseless, begged for mercy. The Medici, long exiled, returned to power. For Machiavelli, the disaster was personal. His experiment with militia, his masterpiece, lay in ruins. He had believed citizens could defend liberty, but they had broken before Spain's might. Critics jeered that his theories were naive, his army a farce. Later, in exile, he would still defend the principle. He argued that failure lay not in the idea, but in the execution, in Florence's lack of commitment. But the wound was deep. The collapse of his militia marked the collapse of the republic he served. It is worth pausing here to see him in the aftermath. Imagine him walking the streets of Florence after Prato. Smoke rises from burned houses. Blood stains the cobblestones. Survivors weep in doorways. And Machiavelli, once the secretary who believed he could arm the republic, walks in silence. He does not abandon thought. He turns it inward. He asks why citizen soldiers faltered. He asks whether liberty can survive without force. He asks whether men, however free, can ever be trained to endure the brutal discipline of war. These questions will haunt him, just as Leonardo was haunted by unfinished works. For Machiavelli, the militia was his experiment, his art, and like Leonardo's paintings left incomplete, it revealed brilliance but ended in frustration. From these years, Machiavelli drew one of his deepest lessons. Power without arms is fragile. Words, laws, counsels, all crumble if not defended by force. Florence had liberty, but without an army it had no shield. This conviction would echo through all his writings. In The Prince, in the Discourses, in the Art of War, he returned again and again to the same truth. A state that relies on others to fight for it is doomed. Only arms of its own, held by its own citizens, can preserve freedom. Thus, between 1507 and 1512, Niccolò Machiavelli attempted what no Florentine secretary before him had tried: to turn citizens into soldiers, to give liberty its own defense. For a brief moment, it succeeded at Pisa. But at Prato it collapsed, and with it collapsed the republic he served. For Machiavelli, the failure was bitter. He lost not only his army, but his office, his city's trust, and soon his freedom. The Medici would return, and Machiavelli, once a servant of the republic, would be cast out. But though the experiment ended in ruin, the lessons endured. Like Leonardo's fading fresco, Machiavelli's militia left behind not product, but insight. Truths about men, power, and war that would shape the book he would write in exile. A book that would outlive empires. And so we leave him here, a secretary turned soldier, a thinker turned commander, a man who reached for a republic's strength and found only its fragility. Ahead lay downfall, arrest, exile. But in that exile, words sharper than swords would be born. In the summer of 1512, Florence trembled. The Spanish army, allied with the Pope and the returning Medici, descended upon Tuscany. Machiavelli's militia, brave in theory, faltered in practice. At the Battle of Prato, Florence's defense collapsed. The Spanish stormed the town. Streets ran red. Buildings burned. Panic spread across the Republic. Survivors fled into Florence, carrying tales of slaughter. The Signoria, faced with ruin, surrendered. And with that surrender, Florence's experiment in Republican liberty ended. After nearly 2 decades, the Medici returned. For Niccolò Machiavelli, the change was devastating. He had served the Republic faithfully for 14 years. He had negotiated with kings and popes, organized armies, drafted laws. He had believed, perhaps more than most, in the possibility of Florence standing free. Now the Medici swept back, their banners flying, their allies at their side. They reclaimed their palaces, reshaped the government, reasserted their dominance. The officials of the Republic, those who had served the councils and resisted Medici rule, were dismissed. Some fled, some were imprisoned, some went quietly into obscurity. Machiavelli, still only in his early 40s, found himself abruptly stripped of office. The pen that had once signed decrees for Florence was taken from him. His salary ended. His voice in government silenced. Imagine him in the Palazzo Vecchio, summoned to hear the decree. He stands in the same chamber where for years he had laboured over dispatches, where he had written letters to kings, where he had guided Florence's fragile republic. Now his name is read aloud. His service is ended. There is no ceremony, no gratitude. He is dismissed like a servant no longer needed. He leaves the palace not as chancellor, but as common citizen, stripped of influence. The streets outside are the same, stone walls, narrow alleys, markets buzzing, but for him, everything has changed. He is no longer part of Florence's life. He is an exile within his own city. But worse was to come. In early 1513, conspiracy was uncovered against the Medici. A plot to assassinate the returning rulers had been whispered among discontented citizens. The Medici, suspicious and ruthless, struck swiftly. Dozens were arrested, accused of treason. Machiavelli's name appeared among them. Whether guilty or not, it mattered little. He had served the Republic, and that was enough to condemn him in Medici eyes. He was seized, dragged to prison. The city he had served now cast him into darkness. In the dungeons of Florence, Machiavelli endured the strappado, a brutal form of torture. His arms were bound behind his back, a rope tied to his wrists, and he was hoisted into the air, then dropped suddenly, wrenching his shoulders, tearing his muscles. Again and again, the rope bit, the body broke. Interrogators demanded confessions, names of co-conspirators, but Niccolò confessed nothing. Whether because he knew nothing or refused to betray others, he endured the agony. Later he would joke grimly that fortune had tested him more with ropes than with swords. The man who had negotiated with kings, who had stood before Cesare Borgia, now dangled in a dungeon broken, humiliated, forgotten. At last, in March 1513, he was released. A general amnesty, declared upon the election of Pope Leo X a Medici, freed prisoners. Machiavelli staggered out of prison alive, but shattered. He was not restored to office. He was not forgiven. He was cast out of politics, banished from Florence's heart. He retreated to his family's small estate in Sant'Andrea, in Pocasina, a village outside Florence. There, amid vineyards and olive groves, the former chancellor became a farmer, his hands turning from pen to hoe. For a man whose life had been government, whose every day was once filled with letters from courts and princes, the silence of exile was crushing. The farmhouse is modest, the walls rough, the fields demanding. He wakes not to the clamour of Florence's bells, but to the crow of roosters. His clothes, once fine enough for court, are patched. His companions are peasants, coarse and plain. He writes bitterly to friends of his disgrace, of his idleness, of his despair. He feels fortune has turned her wheel and crushed him beneath it. Once he dealt with princes, now he plays dice with farmers. But in the evenings, when work is done and the fields grow quiet, he enters a small study. There he puts on his old robes of office, symbolic, theatrical, as if to remind himself of who he once was. He opens his books, Livy, Tacitus, Plutarch. He converses with the ancients, asking them questions, hearing their silent answers. And in that solitude, something begins. In prison, under torture, Machiavelli had faced the cruelty of fortune. In exile, he studied her more deeply. He came to see her as a river, sometimes flooding, sweeping away all in its path, sometimes calm, offering passage. Men cannot stop her, but they can prepare, building dikes, redirecting currents, turning disaster into advantage. This vision of fortune, shaped by his downfall, would become central to the prince. He would write, "Fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force." These words were not theory. They were the reflections of a man cast down, who had felt the blows of fortune more intimately than most. In the years 1512 and 1513, Machiavelli's world collapsed. The republic he had served fell. The Medici returned. He was dismissed, arrested, tortured, exiled. He lost power, wealth, reputation, freedom. But in losing all, he gained the solitude to think freely, the silence of exile, the sting of disgrace, the conversations with ancients in his farmhouse. These became the soil in which his greatest work would grow. And so we leave him here, not in triumph, but in disgrace, a man broken, humiliated, forgotten. Yet within his mind, sharper than ever, the seeds of a book are forming. A book that will change the way the world thinks of power. Exile is a strange companion. It strips away the noise of power, leaving silence. It takes away office, but leaves memory. It removes the city, but leaves the mind. For Niccolò Machiavelli, exile was both humiliation and liberation. Cast out from Florence, tortured, forgotten, he seemed ruined. But in that ruin, something began to stir. The slow shaping of the work that would define his name for centuries, the prince. At Sant'Andrea in Percasina, his family's estate outside Florence, daily life was simple. Niccolò rose with the sun, worked the land, oversaw vineyards and olive trees. He walked fields, watched peasants labour, played dice with neighbours. But the simplicity grated. In letters to friends, he confessed his despair. He longed for politics, for council chambers, for embassies. "I am rotting here," he wrote. "Fortune has abandoned me." And yet, he found a ritual to keep himself alive. Each evening, when work was done, he withdrew to his small study. He shed the dusty clothes of the farm and put on his old robes of office, the garments he once wore in the Palazzo Vecchio. Alone in that dim room, he staged a theatre of memory, dressing himself once more as Secretary of Florence. He opened his books, Livy, Tacitus, Plutarch, Cicero, and conversed with the ancients. "I am not ashamed to speak with them," he wrote in a letter to Francesco Vettori. "I ask them questions, they answer. For 4 hours I feel no boredom, I forget every worry, I am not afraid of poverty. Death does not terrify me." It was in these nightly conversations that the prince began. Machiavelli had two aims. One was personal, to win favour with the Medici, to show his usefulness, to escape exile. The other was intellectual, to set down the truths he had learned in 14 years of service, truths distilled from kings, popes, wars and betrayals. He knew Florence needed clarity. He knew Italy was vulnerable, divided, prey to foreign powers. And he knew, above all, that the traditional language of morality was useless in politics. Men wrote of what rulers ought to do. Machiavelli would write of what they actually did. Imagine him at his desk, a candlelight flickering, ink pot at hand, quill scratching across parchment. He writes swiftly, directly, without ornament. He does not compose grand volumes, but a slim book, sharp, concentrated like a dagger. He writes not as philosopher in ivory tower, but as secretary, as diplomat, as survivor. Each line is steeped in blood, and ink from his years of service. What made the prince extraordinary was not only what it said, but how it said it. Others wrote of princes as guardians of virtue, as shepherds of people, as imitators of ancient heroes. Machiavelli stripped away illusions. He wrote that men are ungrateful, fickle, liars, deceivers. He wrote that rulers who cling only to goodness will be destroyed by those who are not. He dared to suggest that appearances matter more than reality, that a prince must seem merciful, faithful, humane, religious, but be ready to act otherwise when necessity requires. He compared fortune to a woman, declaring she favours the bold, the audacious, the violent. He urged rulers to seize her, master her, bend her to their will. These words were scandalous. They overturned centuries of moral teaching, but they rang true to anyone who had seen politics up close. He recalls Cesare Borgia, decisive and ruthless. He recalls Savonarola, idealistic but unarmed, burned in the piazza. He recalls Florence's mercenaries fleeing at Prato. He recalls kings and popes, smiling in one moment, betraying in the next. Each memory becomes principle. Each observation becomes lesson. He is not inventing, he is distilling. His exile has given him time to shape raw experience into enduring law. When the manuscript was complete, he addressed it to Lorenzo di Medici, ruler of Florence. The dedication is humble, almost pleading. He offers the book not as ornament, but as gift of knowledge. I bring the experience of many years, acquired at great cost, now distilled into this small volume. He hopes, perhaps, that Lorenzo will see its value and restore him to office. But Lorenzo never acted. The book circulated quietly at first, its impact not yet felt. Machiavelli remained in exile. The Medici did not call him back. The Prince was unlike any other book of its age. It was brief, unsentimental, written in plain Italian rather than Latin. It read not like sermon, but like manual. Its sentences were sharp, its tone urgent. It was not timeless philosophy, but immediate counsel, as if whispered to a ruler in the night. And yet, beneath its urgency, it contained something more, a vision of politics, stripped bare, a mirror held to human ambition. Machiavelli could not know, as he set down his quill, how his book would echo. To him, it was a plea for employment, a record of experience, a practical guide. To the world, it would become scandal, inspiration, accusation. For centuries, men would call him teacher of evil, cynic, realist prophet. But in 1513, in a farmhouse study, it was simply a man in exile, speaking honestly of what he had seen, unwilling any longer to disguise truth with ideal. Thus, between 1513 and 1515, Niccolò Machiavelli, stripped of office, scarred by torture, abandoned by fortune, created his most enduring work. In evenings by candlelight, in robes of memory, conversing with ancients, he wrote The Prince. It was his Mona Lisa, small, intimate, subtle, yet holding within it endless fascination. Like her smile, his words seemed to change as one gazed cynicism to some, wisdom to others, truth to those who dared look closely. And so we leave him here not restored, not celebrated, still in exile, but now with a book that would outlive empires, a book that made his disgrace immortal. The years after The Prince were uneasy ones for Niccolò Machiavelli. He remained marked by disgrace. The Medici did not restore him to office. His name still carried the scent of the Republic, of opposition, of suspicion, and yet Florence could not ignore him. He was too skilled, too knowledgeable, too restless to remain entirely discarded. Slowly, cautiously, opportunities returned. Florence in the 1510s and 1520s was no longer the turbulent republic Machiavelli had served. The Medici, backed by papal power, ruled with caution and calculation. The city was quieter, subdued but also resentful. Liberty was curtailed, but not extinguished. Machiavelli lived on the margins, often at his farm, sometimes in the city. He longed for office but was wary of pressing too hard. Instead, he turned his energies elsewhere, into writing, into reflection, into projects that allowed him to shape ideas, even if he could not shape policies. If The Prince was a sharp manual for rulers, the Discourses on Livy was something broader, a meditation on republics, liberty, and the lessons of history. Written around the same years but revised, and expanded in exile, the Discourses took as its starting point the Roman historian Livy. From Livy's stories of the Roman Republic, Machiavelli drew reflections on politics, leadership, corruption, and freedom. Unlike The Prince, the Discourses celebrated not the rule of one man, but the vitality of free institutions. He argued that republics, though noisy and divided, often achieved more lasting greatness than principalities. He praised conflict between nobles and people, seeing in it not weakness but strength, a way of balancing power and protecting liberty. It was a different voice than the one that spoke in The Prince. Where that book was sharp and pragmatic, the Discourses was expansive and philosophical. Together, they revealed the duality of Machiavelli, the man who understood how princes must act, but also how republics could thrive. Imagine him writing the Discourses. The farmhouse is quiet, the vineyards outside still. On his desk lies Livy, pages worn from use. Machiavelli leans forward, pen in hand, his mind ranging across centuries. He sees in Rome's struggles echoes of Florence, in ancient debates reflections of his own city's councils. He writes of liberty not as dreamer, but as man who has seen its fragility. He praises citizen-militias, still defending his failed experiment. He warns of corruption, knowing firsthand how ambition can rot institutions. In the Discourses, he converses not only with Livy, but with the very idea of freedom. Another major work came in 1521, The Art of War. This was not poetry or allegory, but dialogue. A conversation among citizens about armies, strategy, and discipline. In it, Machiavelli argued again for militias, for the need of citizens to defend their own liberty. He analysed tactics, praised Roman legions, and condemned reliance on mercenaries. Imagine him in Florence, presenting the book in a public square. Citizens gather, curious. He speaks of discipline, of ranks, of pikes and cavalry. Some listen intently, others scoff. Yet behind his words is the same conviction that liberty without arms is illusion. Though the art of war did not restore him to office, it gave him voice again. He was not forgotten. He was once more part of Florence's intellectual life. But Machiavelli was not only political writer. He also turned to comedy and theatre. His play The Mandrake se la Mandragora, first performed around 1518, was wickedly satirical. It told of a man who tricks a foolish husband into surrendering his wife, with the aid of priests and servants. The comedy was biting, exposing hypocrisy, greed, and corruption in everyday life. Audiences laughed, perhaps nervously. They recognized in its characters echoes of their neighbors, even themselves. Through comedy, Machiavelli revealed another side of his genius, the ability to see human folly not only in councils of state, but in bedrooms, kitchens, and streets. For him, politics was not confined to palaces. It lived in households, in desires, in schemes of ordinary men and women. He also wrote histories, poems, and shorter works. Each revealed a restless mind, always observing, always dissecting, always translating life into lessons. Though never fully trusted, Machiavelli did receive occasional commissions from the Medici. He was asked to write histories of Florence, producing his History of Florence, dedicated to Pope Clement VI. He served in minor diplomatic roles, sometimes advising quietly on military or political matters. It was not the power he once held, but it was something. He was no longer entirely in exile. The Medici, cautious but practical, found his knowledge useful. For Machiavelli, even partial return was bittersweet. He yearned for greater responsibility, but accepted what he was given. He knew that fortune, once lost, rarely returned in full. By the 1520s, Machiavelli's writings presented a curious duality. The prince spoke of necessity, ruthlessness, appearances, the art of seizing and holding power. The Discourses spoke of liberty, institutions, citizen virtue, the strength of republics. The art of war insisted that arms and freedom are inseparable. The Mandrake mocked human weakness and corruption in private life. Together, they formed a tapestry. Machiavelli was not only cynic, not only republican, not only satirist, he was all of these, because he had seen all of life. Imagine him in these years. He is older now, his hair greying, his body less strong. Yet his eyes still glitter with irony, his smile still wry. He walks through Florence, greeted cautiously by some, avoided by others. He enters his study, pages of manuscripts scattered, pens and inkpots at hand. He writes by day, attends plays by night, advises when called, reflects always. He knows he will never again hold high office, but he also knows that through his words, he may achieve something greater than office permanence. In the years 1515 to 1527, Niccolò Machiavelli lived between rejection and recognition, between exile and participation, between despair and creativity. He wrote the Discourses on Livy, reflecting on liberty. He composed The Art of War, defending militias. He staged The Mandrake, mocking folly. He penned histories, poems, letters. He served, cautiously, under the Medici, but never regained the authority of his youth. Yet in this mixture of frustration and productivity, he built his legacy. He showed the breadth of his mind, not confined to one genre, not reducible to one book, but spanning politics, philosophy, history, drama, war. And so we leave him here older, restless, prolific, caught between worlds. Ahead lies his final chapter, the collapse of Florence once more, and his own death. But even as fortune remained unkind, his pen ensured that his voice would never be silenced. By the mid-1520s, Niccolò Machiavelli was an older man. His hair had thinned and turned grey. His body, once hardened by travel and torture alike, moved more slowly. He was still witty, still sharp, but he carried the fatigue of a man who had lived too much disappointment. And Florence, once again, was changing. In 1527, news arrived that shocked all of Italy. Rome had been sacked. Imperial troops of Charles V stormed the Eternal City, looting churches, burning palaces, slaughtering thousands. Even sane. Peter's Basilica could not protect the Pope. The sack of Rome shook the foundations of Christendom. If the Holy See itself could be violated, what was secure? For Florence, the disaster of Rome brought opportunity. The Medici, who had relied on papal support, suddenly found their power weakened. Florence seized the chance. The Republic rose once more. For Machiavelli, this seemed the moment he had long awaited. After 15 years of disgrace and partial return, the Republic had returned. Surely now Florence would need him again. The man who had studied power, who had written of republics, who had served loyally for so long. He hoped for restoration. He wrote letters, reached out to allies, offered his service. He longed to step once more into the Palazzo Vecchio, to feel again the pulse of politics. But fortune was cruel. The new Republican leaders distrusted him. His name had been too closely tied to the Medici, who had occasionally employed him in minor roles. Though he had served Florence, though his heart was Republican, suspicion clung to him. The doors of office remained closed. The Republic he had dreamed of returning to did not want him. It is worth pausing here, one last time, to imagine him in those last months. He walks the streets of Florence, but no longer with the stride of power. He is greeted politely, sometimes coldly. He passes the Palazzo Vecchio, where once he had commanded embassies, but now he enters no more. At night, in his modest home, he sits at a table scattered with papers. His hands tremble slightly as he writes letters, still full of sharp wit, still curious about events. But his body is failing. In June 1527, he fell ill. Accounts differ. Some say fever, others that the illness was worsened by medicine that did more harm than good. Surrounded by family but not by honours, he faded. On June 21, 1527, Niccolò Machiavelli died. He was 58 years old. His death passed quietly. No great ceremony marked it. No grand funeral honoured him. He was buried in Florence, but without splendour. The city he had served for 14 years, the city he had loved fiercely, let him die in relative obscurity, distrusted to the end. And yet, even as his body was laid to rest, his words were stirring. The Prince, the Discourses, the Art of War, works that had circulated in manuscript, began to spread. In the years that followed, they would ignite controversy across Europe. What makes Machiavelli endure? Why does his name, more than 5 centuries later, still provoke, still unsettle, still fascinate? Perhaps it is because he spoke truths few dared admit. He stripped away illusions, saying openly what others whispered, that rulers must sometimes lie, that appearances often matter more than reality, that men are driven by fear more than love. To some, he became teacher of evil, the very embodiment of cynicism. To others, he was the first true realist, the man who saw politics not as morality but as necessity. To still others, he was a patriot, who longed above all for a strong Italy, free from foreign domination. Imagine him in his study, in exile years earlier, donning his robes of office, speaking with the ancients. He asks Livy about republics, Tacitus about emperors, Plutarch about heroes. He listens, learns, reflects. Then he takes his pen and answers, not to them, but to the future. His words travel beyond Florence, beyond Italy, beyond his time. They travel to kings, to generals, to revolutionaries. They whisper in the ears of rulers and rebels alike. Thus ended the life of Niccolò Machiavelli, born in Florence in 1469, servant of the Republic, secretary, diplomat, militia organizer, exile, writer, thinker. He died without honour, without wealth, without office. Yet his words lived on, sharper than swords, stronger than armies. He gave the world not comfort, but clarity. He forced men to see politics not as they wished it to be, but as it was. He showed that liberty requires arms, that princes require cunning, that fortune requires boldness. 500 years later, his name is still spoken, sometimes with fear, sometimes with admiration, always with recognition. He became not merely a man of Florence, but a voice for all ages. As the candle burns low and night deepens, let us carry with us his final gift, the reminder that power, liberty, and fortune are always entwined, and that to understand them is to glimpse the truth of human life. Machiavelli rests in stone, but his voice still asks us to look closely, to question, to strip away illusion. And that voice, like Leonardo's smile, endures.